This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. First up this week is my conversation with LACMA Curator Susie Ferrell regarding the museum's current exhibit, Legacies of Exchange, Chinese Contemporary Art from the Yuz Foundation. The exhibit examines the premise of cultural exchange and how Western art and brands have influenced Chinese art in the present and recent past. In segment 2, I speak to artist Zoe Walsh about their work. Walsh is an up-and-coming Los Angeles-based artist whose brightly colored works walk a fine line between abstraction and figuration while delving into issues related to trans spectatorship. At the end of the episode, I'll be wrapping things up with some of the week's top art headlines. But first up, contemporary Chinese art. So Susie Ferrell, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Susie, I know your title, if I have it right, is the Wynn Resort's Assistant Curator of Chinese Art at LACMA.
Yes.
Tell us about your position, your role there at the LA County Museum of Art.
Of course. So I joined LACMA about 5 years ago at this point. I started out working on an exhibition here called The Allure of Matter, which was a Chinese contemporary art exhibition. And I was brought in partially to work on that show, and then partially because we had just received this kind of incredible promise gift, or we're in the process of working out a reception of this really great promise gift of 400 works of Chinese, mostly Chinese contemporary art from the Fondation Inc. collection.
Wow.
Pretty soon after that, we partnered with the Yuz Museum, and our efforts in Chinese contemporary art just sort of took off. So having me here as kind of like our specialist in Chinese contemporary art has meant lots of great new exhibitions and projects that we're working on here at LACMA involving contemporary China. We developed our partnership with Wynn as well in Macau as kind of an opportunity for us to curate shows at their gallery space in Macau, and for them to have access to our collection as well as the Yuz Museum's collection.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I'm very thankful to the Wynn for providing me with my title.
That's great.
Yeah.
So that opportunity at the Wynn Resort in Macau, is that kind of a cultural exchange going the other way, where it's contemporary American work, or is it also contemporary Chinese that's in that venue?
So they're kind of open to any type of work. The show that we've done for them thus far has been Chinese artwork as well. But in our collaborations with Wynn, as well as our collaborations with the Yuz Museum, I think, all institutions are open to showing kind of all aspects of our different collections. Obviously, LACMA has, historical and contemporary collection. The Yuz Museum has a fantastic global contemporary collection. So I think that there will be opportunities in the future to show American artwork in these spaces in Asia, as well as to show maybe non-Chinese artwork here at LACMA from the Yuz's collection. This is just the start. So we have a lot that we can work with.
Yeah, so you guys have a show going on right now, Legacies of Exchange, Chinese Contemporary Art from the Yuz Foundation. And I think that's up from last month through March of next year. Can you kind of give us an overview of that show and kind of what that's built around?
Yeah. So the exhibition itself is sort of organized as a manifestation of our partnership and the cultural exchange that's going on between LACMA and the Yuz Museum. Reflecting upon this history of cultural exchange and artistic exchange between China and the West. We chose to feature Chinese contemporary artists as this is really, a central part of the Yuz Museum's collection. And we wanted to highlight the incredible Chinese contemporary artworks that are featured in their collection. I tried to bring out pieces for this exhibition that would help our visitors to understand a little more about what Chinese contemporary art is within the context of the global art world.
Sure.
As well as, Shanghai specifically as an artistic hub and the location of the Yuz Museum. And also to convey this history of exchange and collision between China and the West.
Right.
Which this exhibition is now a part of.
Sure. Well, I used to teach art history, and one of the topics we would cover was this cultural collaboration that resulted from the Silk Road, right? And how China sent ceramics technology west, and the West brought different pigments back to China, and the next thing you know, what we now think of as something that we think of as being very Chinese was even in its time very much an amalgamation, right? And
yes, absolutely.
And I think what we're seeing in this exhibition is kind of a 21st century manifestation of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, even this idea of the concept of the Silk Road was sort of a reflection of the mixing of cultures that was going on. But the idea of the Silk Road was kind of first came together by this European art historian, I think, in like the 18th century. So originally it was really just this kind of loose bunch of trade routes happening between China, Europe, Africa, and now in contemporary times, China is really kind of reflecting on that history and bringing it into their contemporary iterations, like the Maritime Silk Road and these new projects that they have going on. But yeah, I think that this history is reflected in a few of the works in the exhibition. Ai Weiwei's Circle of Animals, Zodiac Heads comes to mind as being based around a story from that's been going on for centuries at this point, starting in the 18th century, and looking at the cross-cultural exchange between Europe and China at that time.
Right.
And looking at the ways that has influenced the art world throughout history and also in contemporary times and discussions of repatriation. So I really wanted to kind of look at that continuum in curating this exhibition and look at our partnership with the Yuz Museum as part of that continuum.
No, it's interesting. On our podcast, we talked about the Benin bronzes and how there's this huge controversy around what's the appropriate means for repatriation, or should it be repatriated? And I think there's some similar stories around the origin of the Circle of Animals. Ai Weiwei is making reference to these sculptures that were originally commissioned for the Emperor's Palace, but he didn't commission Chinese artists. He had commissioned Italian artists who had actually forged the works in France, if I remember right. Well, I guess eventually during the Opium Wars, the British looted that work, and when it eventually came up for auction, there was controversy about, can you really be auctioning off these Chinese relics? But it gets really muddy because they're really not Chinese, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and this is a complexity that Ai Weiwei himself brings up when talking about the pieces, is were these originally Chinese works or were these European pieces to begin with, and who do they belong to? He also has talked about how some of these zodiac heads came up for auction in the 20th century, but were not really paid attention to in the same way that they are now. So they didn't even really become these national treasures until the past decade or two.
The exhibit, from what I understand, it's kind of in two parts. There are two themes that are sort of loosely connected, but the works kind of fall into two buckets. Can you kind of tell us a little bit how you've split up the display of the work there?
Yeah, of course. All of the works in the exhibition fall under this kind of umbrella theme of pieces of Chinese contemporary art related to cross-cultural exchange or cross-cultural encounter or collision. There were some sub-themes that naturally emerged, but not all of the works in the exhibition fall under one of those sub-themes. So one of the things that I saw come up again and again in the works in the Yuz Foundation's collection were examples of Chinese contemporary artists who had recreated or remixed or kind of created covers of European paintings, traditional classical parts of the European canon. Some of these were kind of earnest. Other pieces were quite sarcastic in the way that they were being recreated, subverting the original imagery and inserting humorous or uncanny figures in the places of the original central figures. So these recreations became one of the sub-themes of the exhibition. Another sub-theme of the show is branding or consumer culture, brand colonialism, kind of. The introduction of Western brands into China, and the works in the show reference brands coming to China as early as the late 19th century, specifically luxury brands, the tobacco industry, and also reflections of kind of the colonial presences in Hong Kong in the 20th century.
So like part one, where there's sort of this appropriation or parody of Western artistic imagery. I believe in my reading, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, there was kind of a move on somebody's part to try to set up the exhibit of Western art in China to try to bring in what the West saw as high art. And this artwork kind of sprung up as a reaction.
Yeah, so during the late 20th century, like in the 1980s especially, there was sort of an influx of Western art coming into China. Some of the first exhibitions were, well, actually in the late 70s, there was the first exhibition of European painting to be shown in post-Cultural Revolution era China, which traveled both to Beijing and Shanghai, and was quite influential. You know, a lot of young Chinese artists saw these works as foreign and exotic and enticing at the time. The new avant-garde developed in basically the 1980s and 1990s. By new, I mean post-Cultural Revolution, I guess. And at this time, the art academies were reopening, so we kind of saw the first generation of young artists to come out of China in quite a while. So these young artists were experiencing all of these new influences coming in. Also, kind of European styles of painting were being taught in the art academies at that time. And also there was a major influx of art magazines that were brought in by the art academies themselves. So they really had their pick of different influences to choose from, of European, of US artists or of Chinese artists as well.
And so in that second part, the one that kind of revolves around branding and advertisement, some of those pieces almost feel like 60s pop pieces in terms of, really looking at branding, consumerism, things that, Warhol or other pop artists would have been doing a couple of decades before.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Wang Guangyi, for example, one of the artists in the show, has been compared pretty frequently to Andy Warhol, and has said himself that he was quite influenced by Andy Warhol and also by Joseph Beuys. Shi Jinsong has a quite different perspective, I would say, than Andy Warhol, for example. He himself is Buddhist, and Buddhism really influences his works as a criticism of materialism and of kind of luxury brand culture, and this is where his sharpened blade brand logos came from in his work Blade series, which are featured in the show.
It seems like given the emphasis of the exhibition in terms of China's reaction to Western imagery and their reaction to Western brands, it seems like this is a great starting point for people who aren't real familiar with contemporary Asian work to kind of have an entry point in there, because they can understand the references being from the West. It's not that any sort of inside cultural information from the East, there's not a lot of that needs to be explained, because they're referencing things that, as someone in the West, you probably have some familiarity with, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, one thing that's I wanted to do with this exhibition is to make it kind of accessible to all of our audiences who are visiting LACMA. So we put in a special effort to make sure that, all of the labels can be read in Chinese, and the artist names are featured in Chinese, and our events are kind of showing a special attention to the Chinese artists and Chinese visitors. But I think that one thing about an exhibition that's about cross-cultural exchange is that I think that a lot of people from the West can also see themselves in these works. And I think a really kind of special experience about going to a museum is seeing how you can relate and sympathize or empathize with what the artist is expressing. I completely agree with you that the kind of recognizable branding or, recognizable the European art covers or remixes, for example, might be something that our visitors here at LACMA are more acquainted with. I think that having those features of the exhibition maybe makes it easier for people to see themselves in relation to the work.
Sure. And maybe it makes the world feel a little smaller, right? And so,
yeah, definitely.
So, you don't have to answer this question, but do you have a favorite piece that's in the exhibit?
Oh, that's such a difficult question.
See, I knew it was a loaded question.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I've been living with these works for years at this point, and it's like picking a favorite child.
So instead of maybe a favorite piece, is there a favorite story behind one of the pieces that you kind of found to be a special sort of backstory that kind of resonated with you?
I mean, there are so many great pieces in this show, and just being able to talk one-on-one with the artists in the exhibition and hear about all the background and the details of their story, it really changes my understanding of the work. I think one in particular would be Shi Zhiying's piece, The Pantheon. I was talking to Shi Zhiying about this work in the planning stages of the show, and she was telling me about the background behind it and how on her visit to Rome in 2013, she had gone to visit the Pantheon about 3 times a day, every day while she was there.
Wow.
And kind of just enjoyed watching the light change in the space, as if it was like a Turrell artwork, as the oculus at the top of the Pantheon, of course, changes the view of the building throughout the day. And finally kind of landed on this piece that has just dramatic lighting of the ceiling of the dome and the dark night sky through the oculus itself. And the way she talked about this sort of universal experience that people have around the world of awe, and especially of awe in relation to history and spirituality, as well as practices around death. I thought it was really interesting, and that I could see myself having a similarly awe-inspiring experience in the Pantheon.
Right. The show is up through March 13th. And are there any other projects you're working on right now that you'd like to tell us about, or that are like on the horizon, or that we can keep an eye out for?
Yeah, actually, I'm about to start the install period for an exhibition called Ink Dreams, which will be selections from the Fondation Ink collection, that promise gift that I actually brought up at the beginning of our conversation. That's going to be opening in mid-September, September 19th at LACMA, and actually is going to be in the space just adjacent to Legacies of Exchange. So we'll have just an incredible amount of Chinese contemporary art up all at once. Looking forward to that one.
Yeah. So is there a big keystone piece that, of that exhibit that you're pretty excited about, or is it just a great collection?
I mean, it's a fantastic collection. It's all related to ink, but kind of expanding the material of ink and the history of ink painting in East Asia to be something beyond just material. So to look at photographs, sculpture that shares the language of ink painting and the references that ink artists today make to historical ink painting, and also expanding beyond just East Asia. So looking at how ink art has influenced the global contemporary art world today.
Well, that sounds really cool. And so, so it sounds like you have a great job, and it sounds like you're pretty happy with your job.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Well, Susie, I'm so grateful that you're willing to take time out of your day to talk with us, and
thank you so much.
And hopefully my listeners can make it out. If they needed any more information, I'm sure LACMA has a site. Is it just LACMA.org or
yes,
what?
LACMA.org, and there will be a tab where you can see all our current exhibitions and information about that.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Susie.
Oh, thank you so much, Greg.
All right.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. So I've been talking a lot in these spots about how my Canvia is great for finding art, learning about art, displaying art, historic works, all the way up to NFTs, which you can view directly from your crypto wallet. Click on your NFT, see it on your Canvia. But did you know that your Canvia is also great for viewing collectibles? A few months back, I jumped on the NBA Top Shot bandwagon and started collecting moments. Moments are NBA Top Shot's version of a video trading card that reflects a particular play by a particular player in a particular game. Like any collectible, quantities are limited. I was lucky enough to obtain and sell a pretty valuable moment, which has funded my further collecting on the platform. So now I have 20 or so of these moments, and the cool thing about my Canvia is that those moments can now move from the NBA Top Shot website and onto my wall via my Canvia. So just tonight, I downloaded a moment from one of my favorite hometown players and started playing it on my Canvia. The process took about 10 seconds, and since the 16:9 aspect ratio of the full HD Canvia is the same as the aspect ratio of the Top Shot moments, the collectible looks amazing on my wall. So if you want to learn more about Canvia and all the device has to offer, head over to canvia.art and check it out. And now, my conversation with Zoe Walsh about colorful poolsides. So, Zoe Walsh, thank you for joining me on the podcast today to talk about your work, your process, and your journey. Sometimes the best place for us to start is kind of in you, the artist's words. For someone who's never seen your work, how would you describe your work to them?
Cool. That's a great question to begin. And thank you so much for having me, Craig. So I guess I would, I think the way I would begin to describe my work would be to say that I make paintings that are exploring the boundaries between or across media, such as photography, film, digital media, and sculpture. And that in doing so, I'm hoping to propose models for trans spectatorship, or more broadly, to speak to entanglements of imagination and embodiment that could be a ground for world making. So it's that to me is happening in this kind of the inherent misregistration of the address from, for example, painting to photography or another media. Practically, I or like in formally speaking, I use quotations from appropriated photographs, usually connected to like a queer archive, to build a digital set on SketchUp, make virtual renderings of that set, moving around it, and then create montages. And each montage becomes a plan for a painting. And the paintings themselves are built up with adjacent screen prints, and then stencils, and then after screen printing, these in CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow paint, building up further with translucent glazes in that same palette, and to the point where at times the paintings become illusionistic, and then other times surface is emphasized, and yeah, so it's sort of playing with a space between repetition and illusionism in a way. Yeah, so that would be an overview. That's probably long, depending on the.
No. It's fine. There's a lot to unpack there. You know, I met you at the Felix Art Fair at the Hollywood Roosevelt, and I felt like your work just kind of jumped off the walls, right? I guess when we go to talk about your work, there are really two things. You know, there's the content and the form, right? And the form, it's just the colors that you're able to create by using these built up screens is amazing. And then, you know, these worlds that you build are relatively abstracted, but the longer you look, you start seeing all of this content that's under there. And my understanding is that the content has intent in terms of what you're communicating, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these scenes, if we look long enough, we see what look like poolside party scenes, which kind of, you know, when I was coming to it with it kind of a blank slate, kind of reminded me of like Slim Aaron's Palm Springs sort of photography. But it's been manipulated to the point where it's this beautiful abstraction. But you're not appropriating Slim Aaron's photography. Your photography is coming from somewhere else, right?
Yeah, that's correct. But these, so the sort of the starting place actually for this series of paintings are a series of pictures made by Falcon Studios in the late 70s. Falcon Studios is one of it's a major producer of gay pornography, and they're also an early producer in the U.S. And the One Archives at USC has a lot of Falcon materials. I was browsing through these Falcon Studios still images at the archive, and saw these photographs set poolside. So that was thinking about that material, coming back to it, and wanting to work with it, generated this series of paintings. So I think, but then there's also other motifs like laced into the SketchUp set. So I was also drawing from like Julia Schulman, like Southern California modernist architectural pictures, particularly like that feature Richard Neutra thing. So there's like, I can see, you could come to it with a variety of different sort of reference points, especially with that sort of Southern California landscape. I guess genre in mind. But I think it can be interesting to see. I think different people bring different backgrounds in terms of what images they've consumed to the pictures, to the paintings.
You've deconstructed these images and reconstructed them. I didn't know about the fact that you were actually creating, SketchUp worlds, and so that makes a little bit more sense. But like, whenever I would look at your work, there is at least one figure in each piece, and you can kind of make that out. But that figure is usually silhouetted, and sometimes it looks intentionally flat, like you've created kind of like a 2D representation of this figure as it sits in that space. Is there a particular reason that we're not getting any more information than just kind of a silhouette for those figures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to distill into a simple answer a little bit, because it can be quite convoluted. I started doing this kind of distillation of the figure into a silhouette in grad school. It started with cutting out, wanting to move from a space where I was making these paintings on Photoshop to making plans for paintings that involved like a kind of a projected light tableau in my studio. So I was cutting foam core like silhouettes from like that were based on photographs. So there was this flattening that occurred, and then shining lights on those, and that cast shadows and took you pictures. But then when I started doing that, the silhouette became really interesting, in part because it's like the silhouette itself is sort of a hybrid form between painting and photography. Drawing and photography. At least one of the many like origin of drawing stories. There's this like young woman's like lover's shadow being projected on the wall and her tracing it before he leaves. This like, and that also has that relationship to photography, and then kind of this darker side of the silhouette, where in early photographic practices it's used as like a taxonomy for like police, or like as like a way of identifying like criminals or potential like criminality. So I think I became interested in how the silhouette could have some descriptive, like on one hand, it's great for painting because it has this like flatness that's like, I think is like works well in a painting space. But I was interested in how it could be descriptive, but not like determinative of a body, and kind of like play between like, it's sort of shifting the way that like as you move around it in space, it shifts. It doesn't stay stagnant. So you couldn't really identify. It doesn't give you like all these markers of a body that you might use to surveil and capture it, but it still has like some clues.
No, and it's really interesting because hearing you talk about having the works kind of open up a dialogue about queer and trans iconography. When I look at that silhouette, it makes me think in that frame of reference that a silhouette can be deceiving. What are we to assume about this silhouette in terms of a given gender, right? It's not fair to ask an artist, tell me everything that goes on your mind, because even if you tell us everything that goes on in your mind, we still have our beholder's share, and we fill in the gaps in all sorts of interesting ways. But was that any part of it, the fact that a silhouetted figure can kind of play in this area of gender fluidity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's again, I think it's sort of trying to I pause for a second to think how to answer that, because I appreciate the way like you're trying to get to this question, which actually doesn't people often ask me, and it's kind of at the heart of the work, in that, like, on one hand, it's kind of, I mean, in some ways I'm thinking more about sort of trans spectatorship than like representing a trans body, whatever that is. But at the same time, I'm thinking about identification in like film spectatorship, for example. I guess I like the idea of like opening up the possibilities for what kind of shape a body could take in a way, or what shape, like there's not something there. I think it could be, there's a source, like the source material for these forms are like gay pornography,
right.
But in the painting space, there's, I think you'd be kind of, it's maybe a little bit more difficult to exactly name, the gender of these, or the sex of these figures. I guess,
right.
Like, it's pretty slippery. But yeah, I think I am interested in making that like process of reading the body less. Like, I don't want the paintings to be about like reading the body in that way, where you're like, oh, I understand, I'm drawing all these conclusions about these figures based on the specific like contours of their body. Just
being around a swimming pool, I know that, there are usually two types of swimming pools, like the swimming pool in your backyard, which is an oasis, versus a swimming pool that's like a public pool, which can be a source of anxiety for anyone. And it's in, physical expectations at a public pool are very binary, and it seems like that would, be a place of anxiety. And so I guess, was there something specific about the nature of the swimming pool that kind of attracted you to this body of falcon photography?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said, a lot of it in that your lead up to that question. I mean, because the idea of the pool, or like, the act of like getting in the water, and it's kind of has this allure of feeling embodied, being, having this direct experience that's not, there are all these like promises at the pool, but the actual like social constructs that are surround that space are, problematic, and they can, over time, in a variety of different ways for different like people.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I was definitely thinking about, I was thinking about that, my experience of pools, like as a trans person, and yeah, how it's as much, there's this like this watching, this experience of sort of watching from the side in a way. And that to me, sort of parallel to the experience of looking at these pictures in the archive. I think that then, like, what I would hope to do, and maybe what you're getting at with like the like pleasurableness of the painting, is to have this kind of active looking or imagining become a bridge into like being, in a way. So yeah, I mean, it is in a way, like a lot of the work, I guess, is in a way about a kind of visual pleasure that's happening like at a remove. But I hope that there's also, in the way the paintings are made, since they have these like screen printed layers beneath the thicker glazes of paint, that they always have these gaps and overlaps and stuff, that there's a kind of instability to the image at the same time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so that's kind of sort of hoping to hold those things in tension a bit. Yeah, and the other thing about the pool is that it brings up this like question of surface and depth. That's like one of the, like, I feel like, eternal painting questions.
Right.
So that was enticing to deal with, and I think it correlates to the way bodies are read in the world.
There's so many layers on the content and the form. And I think it's a smart way to go about what you're trying to do allegorically. And it's and the painting just couldn't be more beautiful. And so, can we talk a little bit about how you execute these? I know that you're starting with source imagery. You're making screens. Are they lots of little screens?
Yeah, they are. They are lots of little screens. I have a whole system where I'm like cycling in and out these screens. It's kind of nutty, but it's kind of it serves me because it's like it's kind of all about how far I can reach right now. But yeah, and it also is not. I think that there becomes this sort of like the gapping and the overlapping between the screens is. I'm attached to that aspect of the work as well. So yeah, and then having all these little screens enables me to then remix them for other paintings.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
So in practice, like moving from I don't do the burning of the screens in my studio. I'm like not set up for that, but I ordered the screens.
Well, it can be hard. I mean, it's hard to burn a really big screen. I'm like, you really kind of have to have a setup for that.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Yeah, and then like I was like, I'd like to write out all the times that I'm going to mess up the burning and the emulsion process by not doing it.
Right.
And there's already a lot of process in my work, so I just sort of took that one out. But I have them burned by a place in downtown LA called Retech, and then I'll work piece by piece across the panel, and I've been using like cyan, magenta, and yellow for this whole series of work. So I use the same paint with just different mediums mixed for the printing process, and then the painting process, which is done with stencils cut by a plotter. So they still have a sort of digital edge because they're these vector shaped forms. And the paint is applied with squeegees and spatulas. So as I'm working on the painting, the color becomes like more saturated. And I'm moving into the tertiary and secondary and tertiary colors, and it's all translucent. So there's no actual like painted opacity in the work. So it's all of this like the light of the bright white ground is kind of playing a role too, and that the light passing through the layers and the color.
When you start a piece, I mean, you have a plan. Have you rigidly pre-planned each piece, or have you allowed yourself to be intuitive in terms of creating on the fly? Because I feel like if I were following your process, I might try to pre-plan some of these things digitally and wind up kind of tying myself to things. But then again, you could be intuitively feeling your way through there. How's your process working there?
Yeah, that's another really, really good question. I have kind of two strands of the paintings that I make. Like I have paintings that are really they're really planned, and then I'll make a study, and that becomes I'll do like a small 12-inch by 24-inch painting, for example, using the same process. And that's where I can see about sort of changes made on the level of like design, or like the drawing aspect, like moving shapes around, switching things up. And then usually once I've gone through and I've sort of changed things and I'm working on a bigger painting, more of the changes from the digital to the painting occur along the lines of color. I think that becomes really exciting and very much unknown when I start. Like there's always a departure from the digital, and I think that's like inherent again to like working from looking at additive color mixing to working in subtractive color mixing with paint. Like the two will never be the same. And even that fact gives me like this permission to let things open up. But then I have another, so then I use the screens that I've I've used for that painting, for example, to remix for more like typically smaller paintings, and those are a little bit more open. I try to keep like sort of the same terms of the painting space, but they're just the sort of planning process is different, and in that one they'll change more as they're made, where I'll be going back and forth between putting down a screen layer or a painted glaze layer, and then looking back into the computer and playing with different possibilities for shapes and colors, and they're less predetermined from the outset, I would say.
So do you have rules that say I don't want to layer up more than 2 or 3 layers? Because it seems like at some point, just because of the whole CMY nature of it, things could start devolving into mud. Are you careful to only have 2 colors overlapping, or Is that question?
Yeah,
make
no,
sense?
I mean, it definitely makes sense. I almost feel like the process of becoming mud is like a lot slower, just working in the CMY palette in this way. Like the color shifts occur really gradually, the way that I work. So it actually, like, I almost feel like it would be interesting for me to explore trying to go to mud more often, because that rarely happens. Yeah.
Right.
I think, and yeah, I think that I guess I'm also, there's something that I'm doing in the planning where I have that sort of in mind, that if I'm overlapping all 3 at once at too high a level of saturation, there's going to be like, a deep kind of brown color, and that hasn't been part of like the color space in this series of paintings. So maybe I'm also, avoiding that at the outset.
So the paint, it's like a normal acrylic, but you're thinning it with something that makes it go on more like screen ink. I'm sorry I'm asking so many technical questions. You're a very interesting person for me to talk to, because I was in my last podcast, the artist was asking me, how did you look at works? Well, like, I'm really attracted to color, and I'm really interested in process. And so like I go to talk to Zoe, and like all I want to talk about is, color and process, right? And so
I'm happy to talk about color and process, and it's helpful for me to break it down too, because it's like there are things that you're doing, and then until you like named them, sometimes I don't think about what I'm doing until I articulate it. It's just like becomes a practice that's embodied or something. But just forgotten because it's part of this. But the paint, it's actually the opposite. I'm usually like thickening it so that I can use it, so that I can like pull it across in a translucent like glaze. It sort of it gives me like a level of control, and also like there's kind of a minimal trace. Like there are like indexes of the squeegees and the spatulas, but they're pretty subtle, I think. So that like the thickness helps me do that. I think one thing that can become like something to watch can be when there's like a really detailed passage, that it becomes like the relief can get kind of intense, and then that becomes like an interesting problem. But the screen printed part, like that paint is like a much thinner deposit that's sinking in to the primed canvas, but then when I'm squeegeeing, it's pretty thick.
It looks like you really have a great deal of confidence about what you're doing right now. And is this a theme and a process that you found when you were in grad school, or was it when you got back to LA? How did you put the pieces together that have you with this current body of work?
It's been slowly building since my last semester at grad school. I think that's when I had a kind of breakthrough with my work, in terms of, I guess, the process of composition, and then bringing in all these new questions. Like that injected, like this moment in grad school when I stopped making all my plans for paintings using just like Photoshop montage to having this intermediary process where I'm dealing with like this like space now using the SketchUp set, at that time using the like a dark classroom with just like lights shining on cutouts. Like that totally changed like the trajectory for the paintings, and since then I think I've been just putting things together or building on that. I had some really great feedback at the end of my time at Yale from Anoka Faruqi, who's one of the directors of the painting program, and she was saying that there was like an illusion of translucency in my work, but actually no actual translucency. And then that became something that I mined the next year when I had a residency, and I had some time to like play with how I could make the paintings through translucent glazes. And then once I got back to LA, I started introducing these other technologies like screen printing, and the vector shaped like stencils cut by a plotter, and that those things, like I think that those shifts helped me bring, like I worked for a long time digitally, and for a long time I think I was losing a lot of that work when I was moving it from the digital to the painting.
Right.
And I think that those shifts that happened back in LA with those technologies, like they've enabled me to bring more of that work into the painting space, which has been really like exciting. But yeah, I mean, it's just sort of been piece by piece putting it together. And I think, yeah, it's been, I'm excited. Like I'm excited about where the work has now, and it doesn't feel like it's been that so long that I've been in this place with it. So it's like, it definitely, it still in a way feels a little bit new to be, I don't know, like it feels as though I'm sort of hitting a stride in a kind of process.
Right.
Like even when I was working on my solo show last summer for MMB, making that work, it was still so new to me using the plotter cut stencils, and it shifts. It's cool to get familiar with materials to the point where you can anticipate differently.
Right.
I'm like blabbering now.
No.
Yeah.
No, all I'm hearing is you're gaining confidence in your materials. You're gaining confidence in how you're executing. You're becoming more comfortable, and you're probably finding, nuances in terms of how you can manipulate things. And I imagine that, the work is probably only going to go to a more finely nuanced, direction. I'm trying to remember. There was a study I read about. It's hard for people to anticipate how things are going to change in the future, right? Because we assume that we have all reached a point of enlightenment, even though we really haven't. And so people are like, yes, I've got it all figured out. Then they come back 5 years later and ask them, did you have it figured out? No. Now I have it figured out. But it's, it's often, and so then ask them another 5 years later, like, did you have it figured out? No, I didn't. But now I do. And so like That's
so funny.
But it's assuring to us that, at least in the moment, we have confidence that we're doing the right thing. But I have confidence that you're making spectacular work, and I love it on so many levels, and I really appreciate you being willing to come on and let me put you through the grinder. Hopefully this has been better than a Yale crit in the pit, right? And so,
yeah. There's more opportunity to have that back and forth, I would say. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. It's always a gift to have other people thinking critically, with interest about your work or one's work, and I really appreciate your question and attention. It's awesome.
Absolutely. So yeah, do you have any shows coming up that we can point people towards?
I have one painting in a group show that's opening in early September, at the USC Fisher Museum. It's a group show curated by Edward Goldman, and it's called Art and Hope at the End of the Tunnel. So I'm excited to see that. I don't know yet like the arc of the curation, so I'm like I'm eagerly can't wait to
Right.
see what the installation looks like and see what other work will be in it. But yeah, and then otherwise I'm just trying to like sort of shift into, that's it for now in terms of planned exhibitions, and I'm just going to be working on new work in my studio.
Okay. And if folks wanted to follow you, ZoeWalsh.com, right?
Yes. That's
And
right.
then what about Instagram?
I do have a handle. Thanks for asking. It's ZC Walsh. That's where you can find me on Instagram.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day, and it's been a real joy talking.
Oh my gosh, likewise. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to keep listening to Art Sense. It's been like I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. So
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, the news. So, a few weeks back, I spent some time dissecting the crazy explosion in immersive Van Gogh exhibits around the country from a whole host of providers. Well, one of those companies, Immersive Van Gogh, is back in the news this week with their announcement of a new and expanded Van Gogh experience. The exhibit is partnering with quote-unquote cannabis lifestyle purveyor Happy Monkey. Now, that's not M-O-N-K-E-Y, that's Happy Monkey, M-U-N-K-Y, to provide late-night visits to the exhibit after partaking in cannabis. The so-called Happy Monkey After Dark events are taking place this week and come with a price tag that's about 3 times the normal price. So what do you get for your $120 to $200 ticket? Well, you don't get cannabis because that would be illegal. However, you get access to a quote-unquote waterfront consumption lounge experience, basically a place next door where you can consume what you bring. In addition, you get to borrow a pillow to sit on and a commemorative bag of goodies. The team that brought you TFAF New York is hard at work to reincarnate the iconic Barney's location on Madison Avenue in New York as a flexible, art-specific space capable of hosting multiple fair-like experiences each year. The building is currently undergoing renovation and will be rebranded as Art House, with a growing number of galleries reconsidering the cost of leasing a brick-and-mortar location. A booth inside such a venue would provide a pied-à-terre in New York for a season. Art House will host its first event this November with a roster of 60 exhibitors, followed by another event next May. The venue will also include a number of salon-style viewing rooms that are capable of hosting upscale pop-up events. The former Barney's restaurant Fred's will be converted into a VIP lounge. Art House will charge galleries a fee to lease exhibit space and office space, and it's implied that these fees will be comparable to costs associated with traditional art fairs. The nation of Dubai is building a national art museum that will not own a collection. In what is surely a sign of things to come, the Dubai collection will only exhibit works on loan from other institutions. The flexible plan allows the Dubai Culture and Arts Authority and Art Dubai to create a world-class institution for the cost of building a structure, instead of having to ask the government to also endow the acquisition of a collection. So it all comes down to curation and the willingness of other institutions to loan works for up to 10 years. But that may not be as intimidating to those other institutions, given that most collections are far larger than what can be displayed, and deaccessioning is seen as problematic at best. The museum would also fill a need for collectors in the area that are looking to bolster the value of their works by loaning them for institutional display. The Dubai collection will also include a digital museum where the work of regional artists can be brought together online and shared with viewers from around the world. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and while you're there, Please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. If you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read a transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to canvia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@canvia.art. Thanks for listening.